even before we've had Dreamer Centers or other types of centers. So, and I know that she has been active in this arena. So I asked her if she would spend an hour with us to do some Undocu training, and hopefully, you know, have some fun conversations about what we can do to take action. So with that, I'm so happy to welcome Belinda. Dr. Lum.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much, Mary, for the great, introduction. And I'm really glad to be able to virtually join you down at the Weglyn Center, although I'm a little jealous of your location. Honolulu sounds a lot better than Sacramento at the moment. I'm just going to go ahead and cue up my presentation here really quickly. But I want to start at minimum by saying that I come to this work as an Undocu Ally trainer, as a consultant, because of my own history and family background. I am the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of paper sons. And so for those of you who know Asian American history, you know that during the time of exclusion, right, the Chinese were not allowed to migrate to the United States. That in 1906, there was a big earthquake in San Francisco and fire that burned down the Hall of Records. In essence, basically opened up a loophole whereby someone who had papers that said that they were the son or daughter of merchants, that they would be allowed to migrate to the United States. Well, both my great-grandfather and my grandfather took advantage of that loophole. The modern day word for paper sons is being an undocumented immigrant. And so much like Mary, I also start by having a land acknowledgement that I'm coming to you from Sacramento County in Sacramento, California, where the Los Rios Community Colleges are on the unceded territories of the Miwok and Nisenan people. And I think that it's extremely important for me to acknowledge where we are at, that these unceded territories have been the lands of the Miwok and Nisenan people from time immemorial. And I also want to acknowledge, I know Cal Poly Pomona is on the land of the Tongva, and that we are very grateful for the caretakers and ancestors of this land. And I say this because I think particularly in an Undocu Ally training, it is really, really important for us to acknowledge that unless you're indigenous to these lands, you are a migrant. And so the history is important. So one of the things just to frame today's presentation, I've provided a link to a Google folder with a number of different resources for students and educators, et cetera. Later on today, I'm waiting for one of my colleagues to send it to me. I'm also going to put into that folder a document related to doing scholarship searches for undocumented communities, and then another document that will provide some hyperlinks to some videos that we use. I also want to note that this presentation or Undocu Ally training for my team usually is a 2 to 3 hour endeavor. And so I want you to think about this as an introduction to a way of thinking. It's a framework, and it's also a call to action. To set the sort of stage, it's important to know who are America's dreamers. Nationwide, there's approximately 800,000 immigrants who benefit from DACA. 28% of the initial acceptances since the program began in 2012 through March 2017 were from California, right? So we are at the heart of the work that's being done to support DACA students, Deferred Action to Childhood Arrivals. 93% of those eligible for renewal through last year applied. Actually, that should be, that was in 2020. And then also it's important to note that South Korea, India, and the Philippines are in the top 10, but also have some of the lowest rates of applications from DACA eligible individuals. I think this is incredibly important in a state like California, because the racial politics of California have us focusing on DACA and undocumented immigration as if it's just a Latino or Latinx issue. When in reality, it is so much more. Here in Sacramento, one of the things I talk a lot about in terms of the students that my team and I serve is that we also are very well aware that just south of the campus that I work on, we have a huge Southeast Asian population that has that under the Trump administration faced a number of deportations because of the cancellation of temporary protected status, which is basically kind of a refugee, kind of refugee types of visa and status. We also have a huge number of refugees from the Eastern European nations, like the Ukraine, who also witnessed the cancellation of their refugee status. And if they decide to stay and they're out of status, they become undocumented. And knowing LA, having lived there and the Southern California region, it's not any different in Southern California. In fact, I would argue that it may be even more diverse than what I see here in the Sacramento region. So when we talk about these numbers, it's important for us to have a context that this is just deferred action. These are individuals who, under the narrative of the government, have said, well, because of no fault of their own, which let me put the caveat that I don't agree with this framing, but through no fault of their own, these young children should be given status and not be deported, right? It is a problematic framework, right? And if you watch what Ted Cruz did this past weekend and crossing a border into Cancun to protect his daughters, right? It's a really hypocritical stance at that. But what we have to understand is that these communities, these are just the deferred action applicants that I'm talking about here. And in higher ed, we are extremely guilty of only focusing on deferred action or on DACA individuals. But we need to actually focus on a much wider spectrum. And I think for us at the California State Universities and at the community colleges, where we are at the front line of working with the most diverse students in the country, we have to acknowledge that when we talk about working with undocumented communities, this means that we have to acknowledge that we may have students that are in status, but whose families are not. It could be a brother or sister that are out of status. It could be a mother or father that's out of status. As I just noted, temporary protected status being canceled has led to a number of communities being out of status. I also want to note, like especially in Southern California, you also see a number of African immigrant communities facing the same sort of struggles as well. We also have refugees and asylum seekers that historically had been allowed to come to the United States and wait for the asylum decision. And that under the Trump administration stopped, and at least, as of right now, Biden has not reversed that policy. Although we would expect him to do so. And then we also have those who overstay visas. This is particularly pertinent for Asian and Pacific Islander communities, is that within Asian and Pacific Islander communities, the group that's most likely to go to out of status are students who are individuals who overstay student visas. So they'll come to college, they'll go to Cal Poly Pomona, they'll finish their degree and decide they don't want to go back. And then if they don't switch their visa from student to worker, or they don't get sponsored by a working organization, then they're out of status. So this is the difficulty. This is a problem that we have to deal with in higher ed. And it's an awareness of the diversity under the umbrella of undocumented that I think is really important for us to acknowledge. One of the things I want to talk about here is a little bit of how students identify, because we throw around a lot of terms here. You have the big circle represents the larger population of undocumented students. These can be, they sometimes they're called dreamers or Undocu scholars. Some of these students, as depicted by the sort of blue circle that says documented or DACA students, are individuals who have applied for deferred action to childhood arrivals and been granted basically a stay, that they are allowed, every 2 years they have to reapply. And they are allowed to work in the United States, and they have to pay a fee of about $500 every time they reapply. And then here in California, we have a legislation called AB 540, which provides residency and in-state tuition to those who may be undocumented or DACA. I want to point out, though, that AB 540 isn't just about undocumented populations. It's also been put in place to help those, for example, who come from military families and moved around a lot, to be able to establish residency in California so that their kids can pay in-state tuition. A lot of business folks who moved in and out of state as well. And so that's why you see under this green circle that it's half in and half out of that undocumented piece. It is possible for someone to only be undocumented or to be undocumented and have DACA status, or all three, undocumented, DACA, and AB 540. And that's why we have a sort of Venn diagram. Are there any questions about any of these frameworks?
Yeah, I don't see questions on here.
Okay, well, we could come back to that at the end too, but I figured I would just try to find a minute to sort of move forward. I do want to just take a minute here to talk about DACA updates, because I think that's really incredibly important in this moment. As most of you know, at the end of the Trump administration, there was a case that went to the Supreme Court that we thought might cancel deferred action childhood arrivals. The litigation actually reinstated DACA in full. However, it should be noted that they did it procedurally, meaning they said that you just didn't end DACA the right way. But if you did these other things, you could cancel DACA. So it wasn't made off of really the policy as opposed to how they chose to end the program. So as of right now, DACA is open for initial applications and renewals, which gives you work authorization, protection from deportation. There is some question right now related that's being sort of litigated about whether or not individuals can apply for what we call advanced parole. This used to allow people to be able to travel outside the United States for either humanitarian reasons, to visit a family member, or even within the educational setting to participate in education abroad. The number one thing that we talk about is that you need to seek legal counsel before assuming you can leave and do advanced parole. And I would also say that in doing the initial DACA application, you absolutely should seek legal help. One thing that I want to point out, and Mary and I were just talking about this right before this started, is that it's important for you to know at Cal Poly Pomona, you actually have a grant from the state of California that provides students free legal counsel from Kedison. So through your Dream Center, they could probably, I'm assuming that your Dream Center has instructions on how students can plug into those services. My guess is that if it runs a lot like Sacramento City College is also a recipient of that. And we actually have a website that our students have to log into and provide like their student ID number. Sorry, Mary, I saw that you unmiked. Is there a question or? Looks like.
No, you covered it.
Oh, okay. So, but yeah, I definitely would refer you over to your own Dream Center on your campus at Cal Poly for more detailed information, or if there's someone at the end who knows, we could probably plug them in. DACA renewals are only for 2 years. And again, as I noted, the fee is $495 to $500. And we're, even under the Biden administration, we're uncertain what's going to happen. And it's also important to note that permanent adjustment to status may be on the presidential agenda, as he sort of has indicated. But we know that right now, in terms of a lot of the immigration related policies, the Biden administration has really focused on undoing a lot of policies, and they haven't actually gotten to the point of actually enacting policy. But the number one thing, the number one takeaway from this slide is help plug your students in to free legal services, or if you are a student and whether it's you or for a friend, make sure that you go to your resource center to see what different resources are available to you on your campus.
Hey, Belinda, with the legal center resources, so let's say a student has mixed status family. And so while, they're protected right now by DACA, but their parents or, family members are not, do you know if the legal centers can be used to support family, or is it just for the student?
So mine, if Cal Poly's grant is like ours, it's literally just the student, but most campuses also have secondary help or support, legal services like we do. And so we actually allow through our other services, we plug them in if their family or even friends have issues that they need resolved, we plug them into our alternative services. So that would be a little bit more related to your campus. But I would say in Southern California in particular, Chirla has been doing a lot of community-based type of organizing and resources to provide legal services as well. And they're pretty widespread throughout the entire sort of region. So it really depends. And that social services grant, that for us was strictly students. And we actually have our students actually get asked for their student ID numbers. So since they're parallel grants, I'm assuming they're the same.
So Cynthia is asking, just for clarification with DACA, is the age limit 25 for DACA?
At this point, yeah, it's a birth year. I don't know if it's 25, but there was a particular birth year. I can't remember it off the top of my head. I apologize. I think it was 25, and we're still waiting to see instructions. So what I would say is that I would just pull the application off of the USCIS website. This is where you're actually seeing where we have a team that actually does a lot of these presentations, and each of us has very specific technical knowledge. You're actually seeing a little bit of a gap in mine right now, but yeah, there was an age limit and then a year, but the indications that we're also getting is that there should be some adjustments made. So your center should be able to tell you those particular pieces of it.
Great.
I'm not gonna stay really long on this particular slide, but I think that one of the things that we need to recognize in higher ed is that our undocumented students are confronted by the same type of equity issues that a number of other students face as well, including including not being part of the conversations on equity. A lot of times they assume if we are looking at retention rates of Latinos that we've covered it, but they're very, very different issues. But I also think it's important to understand that one of the number one challenge or obstacles that undocumented students face is actually paying for college. And that's at the community college level or at the CSU level. They cannot lawfully work in the United States without deferred action to childhood arrivals, which is, I would actually make the argument that we also have a number of students who are not DACA eligible, but are still going to college. They may have to pay out of state tuition rates, but to compound it, a number of higher ed institutions haven't adapted their application model to actually help those students get through, and often have unnecessary documents that make the application process even harder for undocumented students. They often cannot apply for scholarships, and they definitely cannot receive federal financial aid. One thing that I think is really important that is time driven, that's important for everyone to know right now, is that March 2nd is the deadline for the California DREAM Act. That is a hard deadline. Unlike the FAFSA form where there's a little bit of a rolling deadline, if you miss the California DREAM Act deadline, very rarely do you ever get any additional financial aid if you are undocumented. It's a hard deadline, and it's important to know that that's March 2nd. It's 6 days away, I believe. On our campuses, it's hard to participate and engage in full campus life. There are limited opportunities, and it's also just really important to find support services, whether it's mental health or otherwise, or student services that serve your needs, particularly if the campuses haven't made moves towards making sure, for example, that you have counselors who understand the unique needs of undocumented students and can provide culturally competent counseling. And so these are just a few of the pieces. One of the things that I normally ask in a much longer workshop is I put a scenario out there that says, imagine that you are 21 years old, and you've been with your partner for a year. And at the age of 21, being with someone for a year, like that's big time, right? As opposed to when you're older, you're like a year, whatever. But at 21, you've been with someone for a year, and and then you decide you have to tell your partner, right, that you're undocumented. And the reason and so one of the things I usually run people through is like, what are some of the reasons you might have to come out to your partner? What are some of the emotions, et cetera? What are some of the obstacles? So I'm just going to shortcut some of that by saying we understand, like, sometimes you want to travel out of the country with your significant other. If you're undocumented, you can't travel out of the country. They're actually, in some cases, you may not want to travel into other states because of their laws, right? Although most of you all live in Southern California, you're aware of the presence of Border Patrol. But if you live in other places, going through a Border Patrol checkpoint is extremely dangerous for folks. The emotion of meeting one's family. If you introduce your partner to their family and the family's out of status, you're not putting only your life at stake, but your family members' lives at stake. But also from an educational standpoint, right? Even the idea, if you go a little bit younger to 18 years old or a transfer age 21, choices of college and where you feel like you can go. Can I afford it? You know, can I afford to go to an out-of-state college? All of those sort of things come into play. And so these are things that I think are really important, and that we have to, that if we're going to talk about being Undocu allies, it's also about understanding the full breadth of experience. We were very, at Los Rios, we were very lucky that Alberto Ledesma, who works for the graduate division at UC Berkeley, was very kind to gift us the use of his graphics. He has a great book called Diary of a Reluctant Dreamer. It's a graphic novel where he has these amazing images that talk about his experiences with being undocumented before there was an amnesty that legalized his family under the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1985. But he does these amazing drawings, and I think that, and I have them scattered throughout. One of the things I want to note is that in the Google folder that I provided you, I have the entire presentation there for you. And so I'm going to be skipping slides from here on out because I want to be aware of time. But I do want to note that when we talk about mental health as it relates to undocumented communities, it is really complex. It's a complex matrix of understanding that, that there may be mental health considerations because of the history of migration of the individual or their families. There could be a history of depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also difficulties with trust and safety, because you need to know that whoever you introduce to your family is going to keep you safe. There's oftentimes difficulty with ethnic identity. There's a lot of research that's gone on around with undocumented individuals that really talk about that when you've been brought to the United States at the age of 3, and oftentimes those young children don't understand or don't realize that they're undocumented until key benchmarks. And the two major benchmarks in which you begin to see a lot of identity related issues is, number one, at the age of 16 for these individuals. 16 being the age where individuals usually get their driver's license. 18, the age at which you would apply for college. And so for a lot of individuals, there is a trauma and under, like, some normal circumstances, we would spend a much longer time on it. But I say this because to be an Undocu ally, number one is understanding the legal pieces. Number two is understanding the socio-emotional pieces as well. And so part of what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is actions that you can take, that you can actively do to be a better Undocu ally. One of the best resources and reports that have been out there in terms of supporting undocumented students was put out by Robert Teranish's group over at UCLA, and it's called the Undocu Scholars Report of 2015. I actually included a PDF of the entire report. I think it's in the research section of the Google folder I sent you. But I pulled out, and my team, we pull out sort of 6 different practices that folks can do. Here, some of this is about all of us, and some of these pieces are relative to maybe our positions within the college, either college or roles that we play. Number one is listen and learn. So often we feel that we go into what I call fix-it mode, right? Oh, I can fix this for you. Let me just talk over the person. The reality is that that a great chunk of what's happening in terms of the legal system are outside the control of any of us as individuals. It is really important that you create time to listen and learn. If you engage somebody in their story, be ready to listen. As someone who has had individuals disclose during my office hours, sometimes it's a process. One of my students, for example, who was in my race and ethnicity class, it was a nighttime class. She sat in the back, was somewhat disengaged. She started coming to my office hours and she'd sort of look around. She'd have some sort of question and she'd leave. And this happened for about a month, where once a week she'd sort of pop in there. And then finally, right around the fourth visit, as we were about to talk about undocumented students in my class as part of a module that I teach in my race and ethnicity class, she told me her story. And it was a long story. And because of that, I had to make sure that I was there for the totality of it. Or, and I've had this happen with other students where I tell them, look, I have 15 minutes, but I want to come back to this story. I need you to come back. Let's schedule something right away. But you have to create the space to listen and learn. This student, basically, we had this discussion. I saw her later in class. I handed her a Post-it note with the phone numbers of people who were safe on campus to call with whatever question she had. And then her next question was, but Professor Lum, who do you trust? And she's asking me to be a proxy. And so one of the things I said is, well, the person that I trust with your life, because that's what this is about. They're entrusting you with their life and their livelihood and their presence here in the United States. I said, is my colleague Sandra Guzman in counseling. She could connect you to a lot of other resources. Well, fast forward, she ends up getting involved in the Puente program. She has now graduated, transferred to Cal State Sacramento, but she got connected to a community of scholars and peers who supported her. She went from being very disengaged to a typology that we like to call undocumented and unafraid. She was able to participate in lobbying in Washington, D.C. with one of our DACA faculty members, where she lobbied members of Congress for immigration reform. She's now a new mother and about to get her degree at Sac State. But the other piece that I didn't realize is that she's been a visitor at our UndocuAlly trainings, where she tells her experience to our faculty. And when she was telling her story, she disclosed that she first talked about being undocumented when she was in high school, and her teachers told her, "Well, you don't talk about that. You need to keep that to yourself." And so my friend who was doing this sort of interview prompting, she goes, "Well, when did you finally tell someone again?" She goes, "Oh, 8 years later." And they're like, "Who did you talk to?" Like, "Oh, Professor Lum." So 8 years between when she had told people about her status. So listening, learning is really important, being empathetic, and understanding the situation. For those of us who are in positions of power, whether that is as a professor, instructor, or administrator, it is incredibly important to publicly endorse undocumented students and to provide equity of treatment. So when I talk about provide equity of treatment, if I talk about financial aid, I'll also talk about the California Dream Act. We always respect an undocumented individual's privacy. Don't go announcing their business to everybody. I've had colleagues, when we were talking about a DACA faculty member, saying, "Hey, isn't Professor so-and-so like undocumented in the middle of a busy hallway?" Not cool, right? I literally walked away and then later on had to re-educate my colleague and say, look, that's not okay. And I also think when I talk about providing information to undocumented students, this is not just an action that we as professors can do, but this is what you can do for your community. Each one teach one. This is a philosophy that came out of the apartheid South Africa. Is that, or as my colleague Sandra likes to say, you have the hookup, if not for you, for someone in your community. So with any information, any access to resources, be ready to pass it on to individuals. That's how you can also be an Undocu ally. Some other practices I'm gonna, Mary, if I go in about another 5 minutes, or whoever's facilitating another 5 minutes,
Yeah, that
okay?
sounds good. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Sounds good.
This is like this was a great little article that got posted in Medium, how not to get your undocumented friends deported. And while the title was a little kind of tongue in cheek, it's actually kind of being real. Know what your undocumented friends, students, and colleagues want shared. It's their life, not yours. It seems really basic, but it's amazing how many people forget that. Ask permission to tell their story. right? Don't just blurt out their reality. Don't out your undocumented friends, students, and colleagues, right? It's amazing what people do on social media. The complaints that I've heard from my students about people saying, oh, I'm doing this work for the undocumented community, and here we are on whatever, 12th in Maine. Definitely don't out where undocumented people live. Understand some things you can do on your own. In other words, as an Undocu Ally, don't feel like you always have to tokenize undocumented immigrants. And I think that given what the Weglyn Center does as well, like we talk about like tokenism and the ways in which the racial politics play out, same thing goes with undocumented communities. And number 5 is probably for me one of the most important things, right? And this is why I always tell people when it comes to information related to immigration, do not spread information that you are not completely sure is accurate and verified. And especially when it comes to legal issues. When it comes to anything undocumented related, if there's questions about status, I always refer out to attorneys. If you need to be able to look up things online, I highly recommend the National Immigration Law Center. I will put that in the document that I put into the folder later about websites that you can use and access. But make sure you go through verified sources. The other source that I think is incredibly important in California is Immigrants Rising. They have probably the greatest repository of resources for higher education anywhere. And so I will also put the website for that in that document that I'll put in the Google folder. For me, and this is why I really appreciate those of you who've been able to be here for this talk, it's about investing time to understand the risks that undocumented people face and how they're treated differently in the legal system. They don't have the same rights as citizens. They can be held in a detention center indefinitely, and that has been upheld by the Supreme Court even before it went even more conservative recently. And they often do not have the right to a public defender or lawyer. This is really incredibly important to know. So it is important to know that the rules that some of us have for those of us who have the privileges of citizenship, for those of us who have the privileges of citizenship, we can assert these rights where others cannot. I think what's really important is that we want to also make sure that you don't make promises you can't keep, and make sure that your actions are in line with your values. And so to that end, I think one of the things that Cal Poly Pomona can look at, or what you can do individually, is be visible in your support. One of my colleagues says that it's important sometimes to do things like, I'm wearing one of our pins here that says education, not deportation. It shows that you are safe in your person and that you are taking measures to be safe and to think about the others. My union created posters that faculty have put on their doors that say education, not deportation. The California Counselors Association, this California piece on the right, they handed that out at after an Undocu Ally training at the Counselors Conference to be able to show your support. If you look at the first page of the presentation, we actually have a sticker. I don't know if I can see with my virtual background that looks like this. We have that on our doors to indicate that our faculty members or our staff or administrators have gone through an Undocu Ally training. We also, because so many of our faculty members are adjunct, we also made sure that we created something that can be put on computers or on their backpack or something else. A couple of things I'm just going to throw out really quickly is that at an institutional level, I hope students and faculty and staff will advocate for developing a strong undocumented student pipeline that starts in high school and goes all the way through the CSUs and UCs and vocational schools. But just as importantly, one of the things that we tell our students is that you only need a social security number if you work for someone else. Meaning that if you are an entrepreneur, you can get an ITIN number, and then then the social security number no longer matters. So we also try to provide pathways towards becoming entrepreneurs. We're working on developing partnerships with our business programs who are beginning to develop fully online programs to be able to support students in becoming entrepreneurs. And then there's the enrollment management piece. I'm gonna keep this really short, but you need to do I always call it, we need to do an environmental audit for our undocumented students and look at what's it like to go through admissions? Do we have multilingual outreach materials? Do we have clear materials to say how you get financial aid if you're a dreamer? And you do already have a website for dreamers with resources that I saw on your website at Cal Poly. You could also create an UndocuAlly training, which is what we've done. And we also recommend that it's nuanced for different areas. For faculty, it's going to be different from faculty, administrators, counselors, student support services should all have very different trainings. I'm just going to skip through some of these things. And so here are like a lot of the materials that I recommend. One of the things as a starter material for any of you maybe a little bit newer, I also put a PDF of this Immigrant and Refugee Children. This is put out by the American Federation of Teachers. It is slightly dated, but the practices in there are really important. The other thing that I want to point out that they have in there is a Know Your Rights card. My union has basically created, based off that template, Know Your Rights cards that we've reproduced by the thousands that we donated to give back to give out to students and their family members, so that if they have an encounter with law enforcement, we can intervene. But I'm going to end by saying this. 4 years ago, my team really began this work in Los Rios. This is actually this is a day past the anniversary of our very first presentation where we began to do this work. We started with one presentation and about 40 faculty members present, where we just gave an overview. From that time, we now as a multi-college district have Undocu work groups at 3 of our 4 campuses. We're working on that 4th campus right now. We've actually put into place a collective bargaining agreements and protections for our workers, where that doesn't require additional reauthorization. We've also put into place liaison work and trainings, but more importantly, we have a very robust set of student services that even in the pandemic have done actually almost more outreach and more individual touches that they wouldn't have had pre-pandemic, because we've had to change our practices. So those are just a few things, and hopefully that could kind of be a good space to sort of leave us for conversation. But I'm also always happy to chat with folks, or you could also email me for additional information. So.
Thank you so much, Belinda. It's a tough task, really, that I asked you to do in such a short period of time. And I did ask Dr. Lum to reduce her normal 2-hour workshop to just like 30 minutes. So that way we can have conversation and have questions as well. But I really appreciate your time and your expertise and offering your insight for folks who may have questions afterwards. I think one of the major takeaways for me, and I would love to welcome all of you to start to think about questions and comments that you would like to make to Dr. Lum, and you can unmute yourself as well. But I really appreciate you expanding the parameters beyond DACA. I think this is something that I have personally felt, really was lacking in our higher educational system, because the mixed family issues, while students may be protected under DACA, but their families aren't, or refugees, or the other areas that you talked about. So I think it's really important. And the part that many folks don't realize, that even though we often think of Latinos as the primary benefactors of DACA, or those who are undocumented, the reality is Asian Americans, I think, are the largest undocumented population. And this is, it's highly racialized, it's very politicized. And I think our role in higher ed is to serve our students and to provide a call to action that we could show that they have support. And so I really appreciate you giving us tips and actual items that we could do and start to think about. And for those of you who are interested in her folder, once you fill out the exit survey, we'll be more than happy to share that folder with you. And then later on, have it on our website as well. But at this point, I would love to open it up. We do have some faculty members here as well as students. I know that there are some students who are interested in doing research in this area as well. And so, I invited some of them to come to hear about what you're doing and learn a little bit more. But do we have any questions or comments that folks would like to share? I'll leave it open. And if not, maybe Daniela and I can continue to ask questions. This is what it's like, faculty members, when your students don't ask questions.
I just realized one of my former students is in here too. So,
Oh.
and sorry. Now that I'm on gallery mode, I can see everybody who's in the room.
Nice. Dr. Davila, you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from our students, but for the sake of chiming in while we have the time. Dr. Lum, thank you for your really important work. I really, really appreciate the advocacy you're doing. I'm curious about, for faculty who aspire to be equity-minded, like how can we do a better job of thinking about not excluding undocumented students and the opportunities we create for our students, right? Like when we're sort of trying to, like, I'm thinking about experiential education. I'm thinking about, like, I have students volunteer with organizations that require fingerprinting, right? So I've tried to be critical, but it's been a little bit of a struggle. And so I'm just sort of curious about what your experience has been with coaching faculty through that process.
Absolutely. I think that there are some pieces that we talk about in terms of little things like making sure you have an UndocuAlly statement on your syllabus is a start. One of the number of things that my colleagues and I've done is we try to also create opportunities. We look at spaces we can control and what we can't control. So, and in particular, my colleague Sandra Guzman, who I often do this presentation with, there's two things that she's done in order to try to help present opportunities. One is to look internally to Los Rios and the community colleges, but also our local friends at UC Davis and Sac State to look at, can we cultivate relationships to be able to present opportunities there? She's also done what I would consider some of the hallwork of looking at we look at some of the organizations locally that already work with undocumented students, but have a broad variety of potential experiences. Like in organization X, would your accounting department be willing to take on an intern, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So we try to look at whose values align with our students and try to be creative in the ask. And it does take time. I'm not gonna lie, it takes some time and work. So step one is, I would say, look what's under your control, which would be what's at Cal Poly Pomona, right? And how can we create opportunities there? Like like the Kellogg House, if they have a hospitality services and you have a student who wants to do that work, can we find a way internal to working with the Kellogg? Am I making it up? Is that the name of it? The Kellogg House? Yeah. Just realized I might be making up a name, but can we work with them to see if they would be willing to create an internship? So we always start with what can we control and then move outwards. And then the next step for us has been to align with particular organizations. And then the third piece, because under experiential education and those pieces, we also will partner directly with, like kind of going back to the pipeline. In our local high schools, a lot of our high schools want to develop clubs that are Undocu Ally clubs or Dreamer Resource clubs. We also look at creating opportunities to help facilitate that and bring our college resources to the high school campuses. Mm-hmm. So we try to also align based off of the other institutions' needs. And then, then it's also, this is where it gets kind of interesting in terms of looking at some, we've also, Miguel Molina, who is our director of enrollment, our dean of enrollment management, he's been really good at, because he has to do fundraising stuff, trying to figure out which benefactors might be open to providing opportunities as well. Mm-hmm. He is unafraid when someone says, I'm really interested in donating to Sacramento City College. He's unafraid to say, would you be willing to keep that resource open to undocumented students, right? And so that has also led to sort of mentoring and those types of things. A lot of my colleagues have developed strong mentor networks that way, particularly with people who are very successful in different arenas to be able to mentor students. So I kind of see it as a progressive process, if that helps.
Yeah, it's super helpful. I think it's really getting folks to kind of think outside the box. As you were talking, Belinda, Dr. Davila and I was chatting her saying, hey, we should do this and we should do that, because I think there are a lot of things that we often don't think about because of the privilege that we hold of having papers, right? So that we don't think about the necessities to provide more support and more protection in many ways. So funding is a big deal. being visible in terms of not necessarily them being visible, but visible to the issue of that our students need more support, whether it's faculty support, staff support, financial support, and then even statements on syllabus. I mean, I think just written wise, that could be a great form of support for students to see that. So thank you for that. Very, very helpful.
One other thing that my union has done is that we'll also look at trying to create like a semester internship where the dollar amount that the student gets paid is $599. Because at $600, you have to issue a W-9, a W-2 or W-9 form.
Mm-hmm.
So we keep the number just under where we have to issue a W-9 form. And so sometimes we'll bridge that by saying, okay, and this ends on this date on December 30th, and then we'll restart it again in the next academic or the next year. So those are little like low-key tricks of the trade that we've used as well.
Smart. Yeah, there are definitely ways that I think if you don't understand the system, right, it's hard to kind of negotiate that. Do we have other questions or comments that you would like to ask? Yeah, Professor Collazo.
Thank you very much for the presentation and sharing the resources. One of the things I always thought about is like, if there's like a coalition of sharing resources, I'm really glad that we're gonna have some of your resources. One of the things that it takes a lot of time and it's worth to spend that time is like when Undocu students ask for what graduate schools can I apply to, which one could I prepare to? Because as you pointed out, you have to think about the state and what policies they have. And it's always changing. It's very fluid. At one moment you can be accepted, and then a year after, you know, the opportunities could be changed drastically. So what resources, are you familiar with any resource? Like one of the things I share is like, here are the Undocu unfriendly people, or here are the Undocu friendly people, you know, like very restricted, like Arizona, Oklahoma, Missouri, or so on. But are you aware of any other resources or any advice that you can give us to faculty and how to better, you know, help and when we give advice about pursuing graduate school?
Yeah, geography absolutely matters. Only 13 states. I would say number one, I would look at, I would do a quick search of which states have in-state tuition, public in-state tuition for undocumented students. It's only 13 of them. That's a really good place to start. On this, I actually think the private schools are a little bit better because they're very self-contained and don't have to do things like in-state and out-of-state tuition. But this is where I also think it's really important to use your own personal social networks. So for me, when it comes to any student that I know that has gone forward with wanting like a graduate education, I'll look at where they're going and can I make a phone call, right? This is where it's important for us to be willing, like if you want to be a true Undocu ally, this is the personal work that has to happen. And so for a lot of my students who go to Sac State, and I know that they're going to be sociology majors, there's 4 people that I already call off the bat over there. Saying, hey, can I put these students down as a resource? I did the same thing with a student of mine who went to San Francisco State. I looked at who do I know, and I make the call and I said, is it okay if I list you as a resource? They may not even tap into you, but is it okay? And obviously, if I know that if I called Mary, for example, she'd be like, sure, you know, or the same with Faye, be like, sure, no problem. And then I give my students those resources. At the graduate level, I think that the University of California has the most robust network in general. They actually have a whole system of legal attorneys based out of Merced that have led the charge on combating almost every single policy that the Trump administration threw out there. And they have a robust system of being able to provide legal services. For example, UC Davis's Law Clinic has one that's specifically for those who've been detained. That's a good place to start. The other thing I think is important when it comes to graduate school is really making sure they have a pipeline for people that they already dealt with the question. UCSF, for example, has already dealt with the question of can lawyers and nurses get licensed in the state of California? And the answer is yes. So looking at programs and asking their graduate directors, telling the students to ask graduate directors, you know, do you have support services? But also what I tell students to do is, even if it's an undergrad center like Cal Poly Pomona, call them and ask those centers because they tend to have much more resources. But in general, like if you want to be able to go more broadly, I think the private schools have a little bit more leeway when it comes to public education. CUNY, UC's, I believe, I guess it's Rutgers or the New Jersey's sort of major systems also have some things in place. You know, there's a few others. Unfortunately, it's a small group. University of Washington, University of Oregon as well. So the West Coast is generally safe, but make the phone call. That's what I always tell people.
Hey, Belinda, folks
Yeah.
are asking, thank you, Jose, sorry about that. Folks are asking that if they have questions after this event, is it okay for me to share your email with everyone?
Yeah, can you share my Gmail one, not my work one, or else I'll get buried under all the union stuff.
Okay, will do. All right, just shared it. So I think Tashana said that the Bronco Dreamer Resource Center at Cal Poly brings lawyers and others that provides resources to centers. And I think Brianne also mentioned our Community Engagement Center has provided support for students' family. The earlier question that we had about, you know, if it's not for the students and for their families, where can they go? So we're trying. I think the challenge that we have is, I think Jose kind of alluded to, is I think there are things being done on our campus, but they're fractured and they're not all consolidated where it's easy for us to find. And so I'm hoping that the Dreamer Center will be that place, but the Weglyn will definitely help and support. And I don't know if the Dreamer Center know this, but last time when Trump was elected, the first time around, and the attack on undocumented students and DACA students, we do have a small amount of funding that we raised through Weglyn to provide support for DACA students. It's like kind of emergency fund type of thing. And so when students couldn't pay for their housing because of issues, that Weglyn kind of stepped in and tried to help. It's very, very small amount, but we try to support in that kind of way. And I'm always looking for friends who are willing to support, you know, undocumented students on our campus. So, and not just documented, but undocumented students, because we do have students who aren't DACA, but they're undocumented because of the fear of going through the program and so forth. So that's why I appreciate your inclusivity, you know, in terms of talking about the needs.
I think also for the resource centers, it's really helpful if they can convene an quote unquote advisory group or like and for us, when we talk about having a faculty advisory group, it's actually not that we advise them, they actually advise us.
Right, absolutely.
And I think that's also been really important for us. Another thing that I would also push your foundation to do is for, if they do emergency loans, to make sure that they open it up, even if they have to change the dollar amount, so that it's accessible to all undocumented students. Our foundation made that adjustment for us, and that has been critical in the middle of this pandemic. And also with COVID-19 dollars, it's been really important that recipients of the DREAM Act at the community college camp at my district were able to get a disbursement, but only if they received the DREAM Act, which made it a little harder, but we're still trying to figure out, that's what we're in the middle of trying to figure out. Is there a better way? Is there another way? So again, I'm absolutely happy, hopefully, like when we're done with this pandemic, to do this in person, or, you know, also if you all decide that this is something you want to scale up in some way, obviously, I'm happy to bring my team who can provide more technical area specific information. So I think that's also really important as you scale up to meet the needs of the people who can be the allies.
Right.
And higher ed, I think, yeah, that's important.
We have one of the administrators here attending from the Office of Student Life. So I'm hoping that when things are back to normal, Tashana and I can talk, and we want to collaborate. So, you know, to do something in person. But this has been really wonderful. Thank you so much, Belinda, for taking time. I know you're super, super swamped with a lot of things going on in your life, but I always so appreciate you making the time. And I know it has a lot to do with our relationship, but I think it's more so about your commitment to the work. And so I really thank you for being here, and we'll definitely make this video available. And thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you at future Weglyn events. Again, her Dr. Lum's email is posted on the chat. If you can fill out the Google survey, we'll be more than happy to share with you the folder that she sent. And then later on, it will be on our website. So thank you so much.
Right.
Good to see you, Jeffrey. Dr. Vallejo is here too. Bye, Octavio. Good to see you.
I realized that watching it on Facebook, nobody would see me there. So
yeah, I did Facebook Live too. So let me go ahead and stop recording the Facebook Live. I know that folks were watching on Facebook Live. And
Oh, is that what was happening too?